and welcome to Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. This week, all eyes are on the summit between China and the European Union here in Beijing. Among the many topics on their agenda, climate cooperation stands out as one of the most promising areas. As much of the world grapples with record-breaking heat waves and devastating floods, it's clearer than ever that bold climate action and green transitions are urgently needed. China and the EU are without question two of the biggest players that can lead the world out of this crisis. But the question remains, how can these two giants shake hands firmly and move forward together? How should they prioritize their efforts to deliver real, tangible climate actions on the ground? To help unpack these questions, I spoke with Antoine Oger. Antoine is the executive director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy based in Brussels. With over 15 years of experience working across the EU and globally, Antoine brings deep insight into EU sustainability policies. His research focuses especially on aligning the EU's internal and external policies related to trade, climate, and the circular economy. Thank you, Antoine, for joining us today. And we had a very important meeting yesterday between the leaders from China and the European Union. And how would you define or how would you characterize the tone or the underlying dynamics between this round of meetings in Beijing, especially in terms of climate cooperation?
I think the meeting that we've seen yesterday is very, very representative of the current state of the relations between the EU and China. These are two massive global powerhouses on so many different levels. And obviously, there are a number of contentious issues on a number of topics between two such global powers. So that's quite expected, let's say, that conversation on a great many topics would be challenging, difficult. But when zooming in on climate, this is one of the issues on which a very, very, let's say, positive narrative building up. The language of the communique is very positive. It's rather broad, of course. It remains a broad statement. But it's a positive one. It demonstrates a mutual willingness to collaborate on this topic, which is extremely needed at this time.
As you mentioned, they released a joint statement on climate after the meetings. They mentioned a lot of very defining languages in that statement, including, the emphasizing UNFCCC and Paris Agreement are the cornerstone for international climate cooperation, and also when it comes to China-EU partnership, that green is the defining color. And so given what's going on right now globally, what does it mean for the world actually to see China and the EU are using these defining languages when it comes to climate?
Well, first of all, it was, let's say, quite lightning to see the almost poetic language on the green color being the defining color of the collaboration. I like that. But I think this tone and I think this statement from a climate perspective and environment perspective in general is absolutely crucial in this day and time. We're not going to go anywhere in the fight against climate change without the EU and China taking the lead. Quite simple, both in terms of current emissions, in terms of historic emissions, in terms of economic importance, as I've mentioned, in terms of trade relations between the two partners, but also with the rest of the world, with the importance of China in terms of the production, trade, exports, refining, etc., on products, materials, and technologies that are essential for the transition all over the world. So essentially, the world needs the EU and China working together on climate. We're not going to go anywhere without them. And so that statement in that regard is extremely important. As you've mentioned, I think the crucial part is the notion of cornerstone for the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, which are the defining multilateral processes and approaches on climate. And in this day and time when international order, global order, multilateralism can seem to be attacked from different angles, the fact that these two partners reiterate the importance of such multilateral processes is absolutely key.
Would you expect something more from their talks?
I'm from a think tank and I'm spending most of my professional life pestering the EU for facts and figures. So yes, and this statement is no exception. I would like to see figures. I would like to see already the updated and nationally determined contribution, for instance, the NDC with figures in there which we could comment and so on. So yes, we always expect more, but we understand that this is a process, and as far as the process goes, this is a significant milestone from a climate perspective. Now we expect the next step.
Exactly. When it comes to the next step, and when it comes to, we need like on the ground, tangible actions that people can see and touch. And I think the statement actually highlights some areas that are quite interesting. They mentioned energy transition, climate justice, methane emissions, carbon markets, and technologies. So in your view, which of these areas mentioned in the statement really caught your attention?
Well, there's a number of those, to be quite honest. So let's say we can start with a methane issue, for instance, which is a classic, not, I wouldn't say contentious, but a very important one. Methane is a very important greenhouse gas, and is so far not necessarily fully taken into account into the NDCs or into the emission reduction pledges. So we know that China and Province Soji has committed for an updated NDC that would line greenhouse gases. And so on this, methane is a particularly salient issue. So it's actually encouraging that it's made its way into the final text, because that means that the two parties are actually talking about it, and there's willingness to find a solution at the very least. When we talk about methane emissions, it's mostly about leaks in the industrial processes and livestock. In both these aspects, and these are also issues for the EU as well, by the way. This is notoriously difficult to abate emissions at the moment. So this is the type of project that's how to manage better methane emission from livestock, from both domestically and abroad, and how to ensure that our industrial processes and the infrastructure can be renovated in a sufficient way to actually reduce this methane leak. Are two examples that come to mind.
Although you mentioned it's contentious, but when it comes to cooperation and the technologies, people can meet on the common ground here. And when it comes to other areas like carbon markets, I think we will see most of the debates or talks and discussions going on in these areas. Von der Leyen herself also said that she had an intense dialogue, quote unquote, intense dialogue on how to make better use of the emission trading systems when she met with Li Qiang, Chinese premier. So why are the two sides having differences on carbon markets?
Well, first of all, it makes sense that Ursula von der Leyen emphasizes the role of the ETS system, because this is arguably the most efficient system that the EU has at the moment to decrease its emission. It's been working quite clearly. And so, of course, this is a system that the EU would like to see promoted elsewhere for very different reasons. In terms of the collaboration with China, this is absolutely crucial because, again, as I said, this is the sort of system that can encompass large sectors of the economy and be very incentivizing for reducing emissions. But for this collaboration to work on emission trading systems, then it's two things. There needs to be an alignment into the sectors that are covered to make sure that we can talk from a level and trade on a level playing field. And there needs to be some sort of an alignment in terms of price for a ton of carbon. So, because of course, otherwise this is an asymmetrical terms for trade, and that's likely not to work as efficiently as it should. And so far, as far as I know, the ETS sector in China covers only the power sector. And so there would be a willingness for the EU to promote to China the fact to expand the coverage of its ETS system toward other sectors, such as domestic aviation, industry, and so on and so forth. So there can be this alignment in terms of sector. Second is in terms of prices. The EU prices for a ton of carbon hovers around $70 a ton for the last few years, whereas China is around 15. Exactly. So that's of course a significant difference. And so in terms of alignment of the terms of trade, there could be some progress in there. But these are very, very important. Just the fact that these are mentioned and discussed is very, very important because they are at the heart of a meaningful collaboration on climate.
So that means at least the two sides are trying to work on these issues, even though it may take time, it takes steps, it may take procedures. As far as I know, I think the Chinese carbon market has started to cover more areas more industries like cement, like petrochemicals, starting this year, but it definitely needs time and needs a little bit of a testing before it really, got launched more.
Of course, the EU took 20 years to have this ETS system where it is now. So it takes time. You don't just expand an emission trading system to new sectors of the economy just like that. The EU is trying now to expand it toward new sectors in a couple of years, and this is proving very contentious domestically as well. So it takes a bit of time. It's quite natural.
And there are other areas that I think the two sides can find more alignment, more synergy when it comes to, for example, technologies and trade. I think EU this year passed its new climate law, which aiming for a 90% reduction in emissions by the year 2040. Do you think for EU companies and EU countries, are they under a lot of pressure to reaching that goal?
Oh, yes, very much. The EU is more or less on track to reach and to achieve its 2030 objective of 55% reduction of emissions. So there's been a lot of promotion of that achievement domestically, internally in the recent weeks. So which is very good. It's very good news. But now that this new target of 90% is on the table, it has not been adopted yet. It's passing through the decision-making system of the EU, which can be quite complex and take a bit of time. But if we assume that this target will be adopted at the end of the day, this will require a significant additional effort to what is being done at the moment in different sectors. So that's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of different sectors of the economy. And in particular, let's say, if we have to identify a few, there are the usual suspects. Of course, energy generation, power generation is still there, although it's the greatest success of the EU, the deployment of renewables, largely building on materials technologies coming from China, by the way. So these progresses must continue. This is one of the cornerstones of the EU-China relation, of course. There's a sort of flawless, seamless, smooth trade of products, whether they are virgin materials, refined processed materials, product, and so on, that are essential for the transition. You're thinking your permanent magnets, you're thinking your solar panels, etc., etc. So this flawless trade between the two partners on these sectors is, of course, absolutely key. And then now the EU, the most emitting sector is transport. And this is not going down very, very well at the moment. So progress into the deployment of electric vehicles, for instance, is absolutely key for the EU. It will need more. It will need to change into the mobility approaches in general. But the deployment of electric vehicles is absolutely key in that regard. And again, here, the relation between the EU and China must play a very important role. And then, of course, it's about agriculture and it's about the built environment. So agriculture is a different matter, let's say, but built environment is cement. And so the technologies that can be deployed to actually decrease emissions related to cement production steel and cement production is key.
It's interesting you mentioned about transport and electric vehicles, because that's the area also in recent years in China and the EU are seeing some frictions in terms of the European Union's point of view. Why do you think they are having hesitation, really, in welcoming more Chinese companies or Chinese investments?
Well, I think this is a very, very classic, let's say, sovereign state response when they face, I wouldn't say disindustrialization, but challenges in terms of its industrial strength. The fact the progress is made by China, the staggering progress is made by China in the last 10 to 15 years in these sectors has put a lot of pressure on EU industries in these sectors. That is quite clear. And so for political reasons, of course, EU leaders, EU governments are very, very adamant into demonstrating that they're doing all they can to protect their own domestic industry. And so in that sense, the EU is sort of in between a rock and a hard place, because it needs to access cheap materials, technologies, products to actually manage the transition. Otherwise, the premiums will be simply too high for most governments to actually afford. And so in that regard, it needs the sort of industrial superpower that China is. But on the other hand, it needs to strike a very careful political balance to demonstrate that it is also at the same time protecting domestic industries in these same sectors. And so this is where the sort of support to industry conversation comes together, subsidies and the like. And this is why this is one of the most contentious issues between the EU and China, because the two partners have very different ways of looking at this sort of support for very different reasons. And so, of course, managing that balance between affordable imports and domestic capacities for EU government is probably one of their main headache at the moment.
And how do you think they can better balance that hard place, as you mentioned?
Quite frankly, open conversation between the two partners. We're not going to solve everything with a magic wand. Again, these are two economic superpowers that are not going to change their entire economic structure in one day. That's just not going to happen. We understand that we have different approaches to these terms of production, these terms of trade, these terms. So there is still a multilateral trading system that is based on rules, that is based on open and transparent communications between the partners and so on. I think the EU and China must continue to meaningfully exchange on these matters, because the EU needs China in terms of affordable imports, but arguably China needs the EU in terms of a market destination as well. So these two partners are in it together.
Exactly.
So hopefully open, frank, tough, but frank conversation can continue to happen to find solutions, concrete solutions.
China has its own plans, and also China has its own pressures when it comes to reaching the climate goals. There are a number of plans right now carrying out in the country. And how do you think the EU can possibly be part of the Chinese actions towards a carbon neutrality future?
Well, exchange of technology. I'm sure China can help a lot the EU in terms of electric vehicles, for instance. I'm pretty sure the EU can do a lot for China in terms of energy production, for instance, as well. We know that a very challenging aspect for China in terms of decreasing emissions is the new coal power plants. That the deployment of renewables is staggering, actually. So the deployment of renewables is working quite clearly, but it's the same in different parts of the world. But it's not really a transition; it's an addition. The energy consumption continues to rise, and thereby the production also continues to rise. I think the EU is somehow managing its transition in terms of energy production based on an energy mix that's likely working and based on technologies that's likely working. So this, I think, is a way of collaboration between the two. Nuclear energy, for instance, comes to mind, absolutely. It is a contentious issue domestically in the EU, but it's arguably the most efficient one to produce energy with very little to zero emission. That is definitely something that could be looked at the very, very least.
I think here in China, what's been really talked about this year especially, is about the use of hydrogen, the use of CCUS. Can they also collaborate in these areas?
I'm afraid I have to be a little more cautious. I know that CCUS and CCU actually, in general, all carbon capture technologies. There are a lot of efforts around the world to develop these technologies, but there's also a lot of doubt as to whether this will be achievable at scale and on time to actually play a meaningful part into the transition. It will be required to some extent, because there will always be some emissions. There will not be like aviation, for instance, is not going to go away. So there will still be some emissions that will need to be, let's say, compensated if we want to be in a net zero world. So carbon capture has a role to play. But CCUS in particular, the technologies are not there at scale, and it's not sure that it will be there. So as IEP, our positioning is that there needs to be an absolute priority put on nature carbon sinks, on the land use removals and so on, and forestry and so on, because this we know work. So this deployment in our mind is more secure, let's say, in terms of emission mitigation, emission absorptions than others. That's for CCUS. In terms of hydrogen, is the same. In terms of as a fuel, it would help in some ways, but again, probably not at scale and on time to replace aviation, for instance, or to replace trucks, or etc., etc. So it has a role to play in terms of stocking the energy, renewable energies, and so on, and to ensure that renewable energy, which is not necessarily available exactly where you would like it to be, and the management of the network and the grid is quite challenging. And so hydrogen has a role to play there, definitely. And on that, the EU, which has made a lot of efforts on deploying this sort of solution, can have a role to play in terms of EU-China collaboration. But this is, of course, let's say, still challenging from a technological standpoint. And something that you've mentioned in terms of that I think is absolutely key beyond this technological development is, as I said, the deployment of our solutions. And here I'm thinking about nature-based solutions. So I just talked about carbon sinks, I just talked about forestry, land use removals, and so on. But the way we organize our city, our built environment, our agriculture is absolutely key. We need to have an agriculture that's conducive to climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. That means having soil in good health. That means having culture that actually can be used as a carbon sink. The way we organize our cities as well. So far, they are way too cement dependent or still dependent. There needs to be more green spaces, quite simple as that. And that the way we organize our cities is also important.
Yes, exactly. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I think when it comes to, transition technologies, that's what most people are watching at the moment, different technologies and so on and so forth. But it's more about systematic changes. And I think that's being acknowledged both here in China and also in Europe as well, that it's not about a few technologies being deployed, but more about a systematic change. And so do you think that can be a potential area that's not been really talked about in that statement and also very high profile in other media outlets, but an area that we can keep an eye on?
Absolutely. Exactly as you've mentioned, I do not believe that new technologies are the solutions because we're not sure they can be deployed. It's a risk. At the very least, it's a massive risk, which we could hardly afford. Whereas the solutions, we have them already. We need to reorganize our transport system, our urban system, our agricultural system with solutions that are already existing. And this is what you've mentioned, systemic change. So this would be absolutely amazing. You would see in an ideal world, having the EU and China meaningfully engaging on ways to actually deploy these systemic changes in a collaborative way. Sign me in. I'm here. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's not, as you say, it's not part of it's not really necessarily mentioned in the statement. I think these are perhaps something that's getting understood, at least acknowledged, as you mentioned, in the EU circles, at least. But from a governance perspective, it's not necessarily fully put into place. For instance, the EU is notoriously not doing very well in terms of adaptation plans, in terms of policy framework for adaptation. There is a roadmap that's supposed to be published next year on adaptation, but we're clearly not there yet. And all of these systemic changes that we mentioned is part of a full-fledged adaptation plan. So if we want to talk about gaps in the EU-China collaboration, solutions for adaptation, solution for systemic changes for adaptation is clearly, I think, on top of the list.
Going forward, where do you think other two sides could face challenges in pushing forward their climate cooperations?
Is the industry. The EU, the political context here in the EU is making most governments extremely careful in the way they balance the different priorities. And at the moment, there is a lot of emphasis put on domestic production and domestic capacities. And this is not the best, this is not the most conducive sector for meaningful collaboration between, or for let's say, very positive collaboration with China, because there are systemic issues there. So I think there needs to be a continuous dialogue at the highest level of government between the EU and China to make sure that we at least understand each other when deploying our own domestic industrial policies, at the very, very least. And there are no surprises, and we acknowledge the other's position, capacities, strength, but also challenges, and so on and so forth. That's the bare minimum. And then, of course, if there can be more than that, which means literal technology transfer, which means literal agreement for terms of trade on all of these aspects, agreement for joint ventures, agreement for intellectual property rights, agreements for, let's say, market access. Then I think the two sides can literally very much work together, and I think this is what would be the best eventually for climate. But it's politically very challenging, of course.
Internationally, we are seeing this gap between the North, the OECD countries, and the South, the developing countries. The OECD countries are facing their own internal problems when it comes to climate adaptation and also mitigation. At the same time, they also have their responsibilities internationally. And the developing countries also have similar issues. Do you think when China and the EU actually move forward, have tangible, concrete cooperation projects, that the rest of the world, that more countries are more confident to start to collaborate on their own?
Well, this is another challenge, quite clearly. We will have to talk about critical raw materials, the minerals that are at the basis of most of our technologies for the transition. So essentially, EU has very few of those, so it needs to get external supply. China has some, quite a bit actually, in some, but is also missing some others, and has developed internal processing capacities, very impressive ones. And so at the moment there is, and that's nothing new, there is a competition, let's say, for access of these virgin minerals from producing and exporting countries. Most of them are in the global south. Many of them are in sub-Saharan Africa and are least developed countries. And so, let's say, a competition between two powerhouses like the EU and China for the resources of such countries, which sits at the heart of very strategic industrial development, a very strategic political priorities. It's going to be extremely challenging to have, let's say, a collaborative approach on the matter. I'm afraid the competitive approach will still sort of a preferred way for many different reasons. So again, I think here there can be a conversation. It's probably a harder one because here it involves a third partner, essentially. So it makes it a bit more complex even. But again, there are some multilateral forums to have this conversation, and these should be used to the fullest. Here I'm talking about the World Trade Organization. I'm working on the UNFCCC once again. There are ways for the two partners to discuss and try to work toward collaborative approaches. But at the end of the day, my point here is there is not enough minerals in the world to sustain the business as usual scenario for all countries. Countries, and especially the EU, the US, and to some extent also China, need to engage into these systemic changes that we've been mentioning to actually decrease their needs, decrease their demand for such minerals, because at the end of the day, we're not going to make it in the current scenario. And so once we have decreased our demand for such minerals, then we will also decrease the pressure that comes to the supply chain. And this will make easier for collaborative approaches. But for that, we need to engage on these systemic changes to reduce our resource needs.
It's going to be a bumpy road ahead, but they are moving ahead.
Anything can happen. Anything can be done.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you so much, Fei.
A big thank you to Antoine Oger with IEEP, and thank you for listening to this episode of Climate Watch. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a quick review, or share it with a friend. If you have questions about our planet or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.